Hi everyone, thank you so much for your interest in my independent study and for taking part in Worcester's virtual IS Symposium this year. My name is Medema, and the title of my IS is Arguing Over America's Best Idea, Examining the Congressional Partisan Divide with Regard to Public Lands Policy. This IS is the perfect blend of my areas of interest. I grew up in Yosemite National Park in California. My dad's a park ranger, and I've had a passion for public lands my whole life. But in college, I discovered a similar passion for political science. So public lands policy kind of bridges those two worlds in the perfect way. So my research question was inspired by my summer internship on Capitol Hill that I had in 2019. While I was there, I attended various hearings on public lands policy, and I was actually really surprised by the partisan polarization I saw demonstrated. National parks and public lands, they're supposed to be America's best idea. They're widely loved and they're used by citizens all across the country. And in today's polarized climate, they're honestly one of the few things that can really bring people together. And yet, agreement on public lands policy is really hard to come by in Congress. So why is that? And that kind of led to my research question, which simply put is what explains congressional roll call voting on public lands policy and how has this changed over time? So for my literature review, I focus on two primary areas of literature, the first being public lands governance in the United States. So the National Park Service was created in 1916, and throughout the early and mid-1900s, national parks and other federal public lands were designated across the country. And these designations were widely popular, and public lands were really not considered a partisan issue in any way. However, in the 1980s, the literature points to what is known as the Republican reversal, which is a phenomenon in which a reversal can be seen by Republican members of Congress on a variety of environmental issues. So this phenomenon was driven primarily by the Reagan administration and their focus on the economic opportunities in natural resources rather than on preservation. So as Republican members of Congress moved further to the right, environmental issues, including public lands, became much more difficult to reach consensus on in Congress. However, the polling data today shows that opinions of constituents have not polarized on public lands policy like those of the members of Congress. So as I mentioned before, the American people are overwhelmingly in favor of national parks and public lands, and this is one of the few areas we see today in which the opinions of constituents and their representatives are widely different, which is really interesting. So, in attempting to discover why this difference may be, I turned to the literature on roll call voting behavior of members of Congress. So, what I found is that there are 5 major areas of influence on congressional roll call voting behavior, those being the president, the effective interest groups, constituents' opinions, the personal ideology of the member of Congress, and political parties and subsequent party polarization. So of those 5, I found political party and party polarization to be the most convincing explanation for the polarization on public lands policy. So from my literature review, I developed 2 primary hypotheses, the first being over time, partisan identification has become more predictive as to whether or not a member of Congress will vote for or against public lands policy, and the second being that among Republican members of Congress, votes in favor of public lands policies and therefore against their party can be explained by constituent support for public lands or a personal connection to public lands. So to test my first hypothesis, I ran a series of multivariate regression analyses and difference of means tests on data on roll call votes on public lands policy. So I began in the 1970s and I chose 2 Congresses per decade and selected 5 important public lands policies that came to a vote in each Congress. And after that, I created a scorecard for each senator in each Congress. So I gave them a score from 0, 0.2, all the way up to 1, depending on how many of the 5 policies they voted in favor of. And to test my second hypothesis, I ran a content analysis of tweets, press releases, and other public statements made by Republican senators today regarding public lands. So for senators who had voted against their party and in favor of public lands, I coded for specific phrases indicating a personal or constituent connection to public lands to try to draw out what exactly the reason might be for their vote in favor of public lands policy. In looking at the results of my first hypothesis, the results of my difference of means test show that beginning in the 1990s, Democratic and Republican senators have polarized on public lands policies, which does support my hypothesis. You can see this trend very clearly in my chart there. And today, as well demonstrated in the chart, you see that Democrats vote nearly unanimously on public lands policies, while their Republican counterparts largely do the opposite. And the results of my multivariate regression analyses show that when you control for other relevant variables, such as the president or constituents' personal ideology, you see that partisan identification is shown to have significant and increasing effects on public lands vote score over time, again supporting my hypothesis. So from my chart, you can see a general upward trend beginning in the 1990s. However, you do see that outlier there, that is the 111th Congress. So once I ran my models, I did do some subsequent research regarding the reason for that outlier, and I found some potential explanations regarding land and water conservation fund policies that existed during that Congress. So if you're curious about that, I am definitely more than happy to answer questions about that outlier in the discussion. And as far as results for my second hypothesis, my content analysis showed that although personal experiences did not have an effect on the way that Republican members of Congress talk about public lands, constituency most definitely does. So members who had high vote scores and therefore voted against their party frequently referenced public lands in their states and appealed to a pride that constituents have and that they have for those lands that are in their states. And additionally, another really significant finding from my content analysis was simply how much more members of Congress with high vote scores mention public lands than those with low vote scores. So Republican senators who didn't vote in favor of public lands hardly talked about public lands at all. It was not something that they were bringing up in any of their public statements. So some of the primary conclusions that I came up with: first of all, political party has a significant effect on the roll call voting behavior of public lands policies, and Republican senators today are highly unlikely to support public lands policies. Secondly, constituency is an important factor considered by Republican senators who do vote in favor of public lands policies today. And just lastly, that as the adverse effects of climate change become more and more severe, federal policy is going to become an increasingly important factor in protecting public lands, and so public lands policy really does need to become a more bipartisan issue in Congress if the necessary changes to be made. So that last point is probably the biggest takeaway that I had from this research. I really enjoyed the whole process. I'm very thankful to my advisor, Professor Van Dorn, and everyone else at Worcester, my family and friends who supported me throughout this. I thank you so much for tuning in to Worcester's virtual symposium, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have. Thank you.